They've been acclaimed in their native Ireland for their groundbreaking use of the Irish language in their rap music and been the stars of a hit movie. But the Belfast rap trio Kneecap have long courted controversy, none more so than in their vocal criticism of Israel over the war in Gaza. Now, one of the band's members, Mahara, real name Liam O'Gahany, is on trial today, charged with supporting a proscribed terror organisation. Ohani is accused of brandishing a flag of the Lebanese Shiite group Hezbollah at a London concert last November. And for more on this trial, I can welcome Ethan Shattock, lecturer in law at Queen's University Belfast and a specialist in freedom of expression. Good morning, Ethan, and thank you for joining us.
Good morning, how are you? Thanks.
Now, Kneecap and their supporters say that Liam O'Gahany is being pursued because of the band's criticism of Israel and that the trial is really just a distraction from what they say is the genocide in Gaza. Do they have a point?
So the main thing is that they've called it both a variation of what they call political policing from the government and also a carnival of distraction from the actual criticism, which is what Kneecap focus on. Kneecap have been famous in recent times for, I think, most vocally their criticism of Israel government and also the UK's complicity with Israel in their aggression against Palestine. So basically, the contention for Kneecap now is that this is not actually a sincere use of the terrorism legislation. It's to clamp down on what they perceive to be their actual substantive critiques of Israel. And in that sense, insofar as they're talking about free expression, they certainly have a point. There is the actual standards in terms of who they are as artists and satirists, and also in terms of how legitimate the actual use of the anti-terrorism law actually is. And I think it's important to redirect to what Kneecap themselves, in their own words, proclaim to be, which is, and I quote, blending satire with socially conscious lyrics and mixing reality with absurdity. This critique is, I think, an example which epitomizes that.
Now, the band described their music as a mix of satire and politics, as you say. And for anyone familiar with their music or the context in Northern Ireland, which they grew up in, that is fairly obvious. But from the outside, it might be said that if you're stepping outside of your character that you incarnate on stage and make political pronouncements like the band do, the line between satire and real life becomes a little bit muddled. And after all, the band has had to clarify that they don't support Hamas and Hezbollah. They've also apologised to the family of a murdered Conservative MP for once telling fans to shoot a Tory MP. So are they probably getting to the point where they're getting just a little bit too famous to really run this line anymore?
This is an important, I think, correct point that Kneecap undeniably, I think, pushed the boundaries of what you might call permissible expression, even in that political and satire context. But I think also two things. One is that when it comes to things where Kneecap perhaps have pushed boundaries, that they have voluntarily of their own accord, I think, apologised for that. But certainly they are in their, I think, especially in the last year or so, having had high-profile events in the US, for example, they're well known now globally beyond Ireland. So that's an important context in terms of their responsibilities as artists. But I think also in the current context, you have to recall that this is part of the UK's current attempts to identify and target what's perceived to be terrorist organisations. And I think in that sense, there's been a lot of controversy about that, and the UK has used those laws. And I think what I think is very important and has been somewhat lost in the last few months is that it isn't just about what we perceive to be as terrorist, not terrorist speech here. It's also about the wider implications and context of international human rights law. Insofar as that's important and irrelevant, Kneecap's proclamations and their artistry and their kind of hedonistic performances has to be seen in the context of, yes, provocative, yes, hedonistic, and yes, in some ways, certainly quite out there, but ultimately a blend of, yes, satire, but also sincere criticism. I mean, there's an actual political point which is based off factual events in terms of international conflict. I think that context is important, even though, yes, as you hint there definitely is a sense of mixing this free speech with the responsibilities, which I think now are increasingly important as prominent and well-known artists.
Now, Irish writer Sally Rooney said last week that she would donate royalties paid to her by the BBC to Palestine Action, which was prescribed by the British government as a terrorist organisation last month. Now, this is clear defiance towards Keir Starmer's government after 700 people have been arrested under the Terrorism Act for supporting Palestine Action. Does Sally Rooney risk arrest or prosecution next time she sets foot in the UK?
I think it's a possibility, but also she is probably in some ways kind of playing chicken in the sense of she's kind of calling out, well, actually, is this serious? How sincere is the use of this law? It's a very interesting move to proscribe Palestine Action. You're lumping them in with recognized organizations like Hezbollah and Hamas. And I think it's also important that this is not just a potential concern as so far as the right to free expression, but also the right to protest. These are important things in terms of peaceful assembly. Looking at the images you see now, the people who are being arrested are often doing so silently for simply expressing some sympathy towards the Palestine cause. And I think insofar as that's important, Rooney might have an issue, but I think it'll be interesting to see how it plays out, because if that was the case, if she was arrested, I think it would undeniably not only expose the whole importance of the whole issue, but also perhaps test the boundaries of how sincere they actually are in enforcing this legislation when it matters and how that pertains to pro-Palestine activism. It's a big statement from Sally Rooney, and I think it'll be interesting to see how it actually pans out if and when she sets foot back in the UK.
Now, Palestine Action has been proscribed as a terrorist group on the foot of little more than vandalism to RAF aircraft at Breeze Norton Air Base. So why is this heavy-handed approach being taken by the government when it itself is beginning to lose patience with Israel over its actions in Gaza?
I think for many people that the answer kind of confounds us in the sense of, if you actually look at the actual list of proscribed organizations, you can see a different list of known terrorist organizations which have a description on the website of the UK's government about why they are banned and proscribed insofar as they are. And in the context of the listing under Palestine Action, it is, as you mentioned, limited to citing acts of vandalism and damage as regards property, not people. That's an important distinction. And I think in reality, the justification for why Palestine Action were included in this kind of list of banned organizations, it could be a cynical move to try and show that you're not, soft on, crime or whatever, or it could be some kind of more, as Kneecap themselves pertain to be, a form of political policing. I mean, there is no singular answer. What is true and what is probably arguable is that the move to do so is at least questionable in the context of international human rights standards, both in terms of free expression and also in the right to protest and peaceful assembly.
Now, having covered the 2019 Hong Kong protests and the subsequent imposition of the national security law, I'm struck by the parallels between this and the prescription of Palestine Action. In both cases, it's a government unwilling to engage with popular contention, responding instead with a broadly applicable law underpinned by a fairly questionable appeal to national security. Now, there's no need to engage in hyperbole and say that the UK is now like China, but doesn't this undermine the British government's criticisms of crackdowns on human rights, particularly in Hong Kong?
This is an important and excellent point, and having been to China and North Korea and seen these things as well, I completely agree that there's an important kind of corollary there. I think it would undermine the actual ostensible or outwardly criticism of different countries having, let's say, subpar international human rights norms. It really does question, I mean, if you proclaim to value the notion of free speech, and not only free speech, but also protest of political activities and holding officials to power to account, then it's highly questionable. And again, this is a case of, yes, on paper and in principle, there are always justifications for trying to limit and curtail threats to national security and prevent disorder of crime. But again, in reality, in practice, and also importantly, in the context of things like artists and increasingly writers and performers, you have to be honest about what you're doing and the reasons for doing so. And again, as you can see, people who are being detained under this legislation are very often doing so peacefully. And their statements are quite simple, often limited to, I support Palestine action. This is very simplistic language often. So it really calls into question the UK government's decision to have this staunch and stubborn, persistent pursuit of people who are ultimately doing things that perhaps even a few years ago might not be seen in the UK to be objectionable or at least not worthy of prosecution.
Thank you very much for that, Ethan Shattock, lecturer in law at Queen's University, Belfast. And if you're a fan of Kneecap, they will be playing this weekend at Rock on Seine in Paris on Sunday.